Braden's needs were simple, and he'd never taken more than one suitcase the few times he'd traveled. His mother, on the other hand, insisted he needed to be prepared in case he should find his mate. That meant bringing along an additional suitcase filled with nice clothes designed for dating. He'd be miles away, so she wouldn't be able to criticize what he'd be wearing. Letting her have her way to keep her feelings from being hurt seemed like the best option. Braden grabbed his suitcases and sidestepped the two males, wolves by the scent of them, that were handing out flyers to the others waiting in line for their luggage. They wore plaid, short-sleeved shirts, worn jeans, and boots. One of them even had a cowboy hat and a wide leather belt with a fancy silver buckle. Braden caught a glimpse of the words Wolf's Claw Ranch printed in large letters across the top of the page he'd handed to the person beside him. People didn't usually show up in a small town without an intended destination, and he realized they might be trying to steal business from the place where he and Jake would be staying. Personally, he thought it was kind of rude, not to mention a little unethical. When the male wearing the cowboy hat tried to get him to stop and take one of his handouts, he growled, "Not interested." The male glared, pursing his lips as if he was holding back an off-handed comment. After Braden straightened his shoulders, knowing it made him appear more intimidating, the male took a less dominant stance, then backed away. He didn't like to fight, but would if the occasion called for it. And, thanks to Jake, he'd been in enough bar fights to know there weren't many wolves willing to take on a bear. At least not without backup, and not in front of a lot of people. Jake had noticed the interaction. He'd set his backpack and suitcases off to the side, prepared to help if things turned nasty. "What happened to you were going to try?" Braden glared at the males as they stalked away. "He's still standing, isn't he?" "Come on," Jake huffed, then grabbed his bags and headed for a spot in front of the station. He walked past the occupied benches sitting near the building's wall and found a place to stand next to the group of people who'd gathered beneath the blue canvas awning. There were two couples and a lone male who hadn't trailed off or headed for the car rental place next door, so Braden assumed they must be part of their group. After setting his cases on the ground, Braden adjusted the backpack on his shoulder. "The scenery here is a lot nicer than I'd expected," he said after taking several deep breaths of fresh air and glancing at the mountains in the distance. "I'd say the scenery just got a whole lot better." Jake smacked his arm with the back of his hand and tipped his head to the right. Two females, both with similar features and no doubt related, were walking at a hastened pace along the sidewalk across the street. There was something about the taller of the two women that drew Braden's attention. Her honey blonde hair, pulled behind her back in a braid, glistened in the sunlight. Her blue eyes shimmered with a fierce intensity as she shot a sidelong glare over her shoulder at a male leaning against a shiny black truck. After the females crossed the street, the male continued to stare with the longing of someone who'd been rejected and wasn't willing to accept it. For the first time in a long time, Braden's bear was making territorial noises, and not the kind he made when expected to share his fish. No, he was pretty sure these sounds had to do with the female, since the growls in his head were directed at the male. He also could have sworn he heard his bear mention the word mate somewhere in his grumblings. He hadn't realized he'd been staring at the female until Jake nudged his arm. "Stop drooling. I'd hate to get kicked out of town before we even make it to the ranch." "Wasn't," Braden snapped, even though he'd been caught with his mouth hanging open. "Uh-huh." Braden glared at his cousin and wondered if anyone would notice or care if he elbowed him hard in the ribs. "Good afternoon, everyone." A pleasant voice had Braden jerking his attention away from Jake to find the same female he'd been staring at standing in front of their small group with a radiant smile. "Welcome to Wayne's Rock. I'm Casey Walker." She pointed to the tawny-haired female standing on her left. "And this is my sister Kelsey. We're here to take you to the Crescent Canyon Ranch."